Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here once again. This is just going to be a more general rant that I'm going to do, just based on some recent discussions that I've had here on YouTube in the comment sections of some other videos that are not featured on my channel per se. I put up a fair amount of content, but most of the points that I tend to argue, and I think most of the time when I rope in new subscribers, it's when I put up text comments on other videos. I generally tend to be more on my game when I'm in the one-dimensional world of text commenting, and generally I do a pretty good job of conveying exactly what point I want to make in that particular venue. I recently got into a rather heated exchange with another user who I'm not going to mention his name because I don't think it's really worth it. But we got onto the issue of Barack Obama and the Libyan war. I just made a real colorful and somewhat agitated commentary regarding the authorization bill that was offered up in the House of Representatives. They ended up defeating that authorization, but they also passed additional funding for that war, which is still going on for the better part of 3.5 months now. So in essence, they're saying yes and no. Whatever sense you can make out of that, please feel free to try. I am not having any success with it. So the general crux of this debate had to do specifically with the notion of justification for use of military force. My support for the general concept of the rule of law, although I haven't given a specific definition of what the rule of law is at this point, but just the general concept of the rule of law, is the notion that I believe that human beings, by and large, tend towards corruption, towards lying, and towards cheating each other. And they do this most effectively by moving the goalpost. This is what human beings in general love to do, particularly when they're in an unorganized situation. The rule of law and the force of contract enforcement binds humanity and forces it to be honest. But it only works when everybody is subject to the law. The law must be objective. It has to be completely removed from any kind of subjective interpretation in order for it to be equitable. Otherwise, it's merely arbitrary. It's my might makes my right. And when you get down to it, justifications for use of military force are usually coincidental. It's just a happy and convenient thing that comes along with the true nature of the event, which is I'm in charge, I decide who lives and who dies and for what reason, which is the heart and soul of statism. I think my dilemma as a minarchist is that I define statism a little bit differently than most market anarchists think too. I think that legitimate government that serves objective laws is very distinct from what their version of a state would be, or what I would think that their version of a state would be. But in actuality, their view of the state has to do more specifically with an actual institutional format, and not necessarily what the laws are and whether or not one group is subject and another isn't, and so on and so forth. A monopoly on the use of force is tantamount to the state in their view, where, in my estimation, there is no actual monopoly on the use of force because everything is contingent upon something that is not subjective. There are many things that are subjective. Indeed, the rule of law is not supposed to be all-encompassing upon every aspect of an individual's life. It's supposed to apply specifically to interpersonal relationships. That's where the rule of law comes into play. Within ourselves, we are basically free to be anarchists. But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, there are some facts of nature that come into play, and with them comes implicit guidelines for how to properly conduct a society without destroying ourselves. My opposition to arbitrary war powers being granted to any body of government, but particularly the executive branch, is based on this notion that subjective interpretations in how to apply the use of force will lead to self-destructive behavior. The argument for the Libyan war is simple, really, when you think about it. Bad boy Gaddafi hit me first, or hit them first, and now we're going to hit them back for them, as though we're the government of Libya, or that everybody is the citizen of the world and that we're the world's policemen, so we're going to get the bad guy criminal tyrant. The world doesn't work that way. There's a lot of people who would like to think that the world could work that way, that we could have world government and that everybody would learn to be nice, obedient little sheep that will not hurt one another and be happy and content. Human beings don't work that way. Human beings, believe it or not, are not sheep. I would actually argue at humanity's worst, they are more inclined towards being piggish rather than sheepish. I think that as long as their bellies are full and they have plenty of fresh excrement to wallow in, they're content. If they're starving, then they will cease to be obedient. Sheep, on the other hand, are docile basically to the very end. They will walk freely into the execution chamber. Pigs will be dumb enough to get themselves into the execution chamber, but they'll struggle along the way. I don't really like the term sheeple because I think it does a disservice to the reality of the human condition. I think piggles are probably a more accurate depiction of the way people are. And that gets me to my basic point with this individual that I was arguing with. This person came into the discussion talking to another user, the one that was hosting the video, and he stated, isn't there something to be said for the notion of coming in and defending the weak against the strong? That was the general drive of his comment. It wasn't in those specific words, but that was the central point of what he was saying. My response to that would be, who is the strong person? Is it Gaddafi? Or is it NATO? Think about that for a second. People like to argue that third world tyrants are horrible and they should all be gotten rid of because they kill their own people. But if you do an honest assessment of the way our government does things, the American federal government and the state government also makes it a regular practice of killing their own people. Sometimes it's in the act of enforcing a legitimate law, and sometimes it's police incompetence that results in the death, and sometimes it is out-and-out corruption and the death of the citizen is deliberate. But we don't hear of any body of world police that are coming to make restitution for the people that were wronged by our government officials, are we? Nah, I don't think so. America being the world police, or NATO, or the United Nations, or any of these other groups being the world police, this assumes that there is some form of legitimate world governance taking place, and there isn't. What's going on here is imperialism. And imperialism survives first and foremost through distortion of language and through the manipulation of the ignorant who live and serve under the empire. Ergo, The American empire and the NATO empire survives chiefly through the manipulation of stupid people who vote within their given jurisdictions. Stupid people like the person that I was arguing with. I'm often criticized for being a brash and caustic individual. Some people like to say I have a bit of an Irish temper, and I freely admit it, I do. But I don't necessarily view this as being a bad thing all the time. There are times when I think I could do a better job of containing myself and being a little bit less forward in a debate. But I also believe that there's such a thing as righteous anger and being rightfully outraged by something that's completely absurd. And there's nothing out there that I find more absurd than this notion of war in the name of peace, or war in the name of humanitarian efforts. It's one of the most blatant cases of collective hypocrisy that I could think of, and I always oppose it on general principle. I don't have time for the casuistry of situational morality when it comes to the life and death of multitudes of people. Doing nothing means that people might die. Being born means that one day you're probably going to die. The question is not whether or not people die. The question is, what are people doing? That's what I'm more concerned with. And what are people saying? Because saying something is doing something. Saying something is a little bit more transparent than actually initiating direct physical force, but words have a force to them, depending on the context. And when I have arguments with people, and they argue in favor of stuff like the Libyan war, it inspires a reaction in me, one of moral outrage. And I don't really feel the need to be polite in those circumstances. I don't associate with people, at least I don't tend to associate with people who think that way. They generally tend to grate on me. People that go by this sort of relativistic way of thinking where violating the law is justifiable because you have noble intentions. That's a kind of person that I couldn't trust in any capacity. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time in the Roman Catholic Church experiencing the end justifies the means mode of conducting oneself that Jesuits regularly engage in. Saw it on the television, and I saw the way it worked in church and educational institutions. And my conclusion was ultimately that Jesuitism is like a cancer, a very malignant one in need of some good radiation. And I view the general concept of casuistry in areas of morality. I think that anybody who goes around looking for justifications for whatever terrible things they do or believe in, they'll ultimately find them, because the world is limitless with excuses, but largely finite in its reality. And upon the duration of this particular argument that I was in, I was given one of my favorite zingers that I always receive and I'm always chuckled by, which is that you're just not open-minded enough to accept that there are other worldviews than the one that you have. I accept the fact, straight up, that there are other worldviews than mine. The problem is that most of the ones that I've encountered are sheer fantasy. They have nothing to do with reality. There's a good number of people on YouTube that have their own idealized version of the way the world should work. That's how you get things like socialism and Marxism. But when you actually get into implementing this nonsense, it just doesn't happen, just doesn't work. And the same goes even more so with Wilsonian imperialism under the guise of humanitarianism. The concept is older than Woodrow Wilson, but he basically popularized it, and he made it the staple of the 20th century, which from a historical standpoint was one of the bloodiest centuries in human history. There were probably greater mass deaths by result of natural phenomenon before the 20th century, but in terms of interpersonal violence, I think that the 20th century was the greatest depression in human moral development, even though from a technological standpoint it was a massive boom. There are countless ideals associated with the 20th century that I think the human race would do well to rid itself of. And this notion of justifying war through the evils of other nations without taking into account the evils that always come about when war is declared is one of those insidiously stupid 20th century ideas that we would be better without. For me, the war issue is a deal breaker in a number of different respects. I was actually asked about the war issue along with a bunch of other Ron Paul supporters back on the Ron Paul Forum in 2007 at the height of his campaign. We were just being asked hypothetically, if Ron Paul were a supporter of the Iraq and Afghan wars, would we still vote for him? Some people answered yes. A lot of people couldn't answer. But a solid majority of the people present said no. It's an essential part of who Ron Paul is, and without it, he isn't who he is. I concur with that. The war issue is not separable from the other issues that Ron Paul regularly discusses. It's really, I'm probably one of the few people that actively campaigns for Ron Paul locally who thinks that it's good that Ron Paul repeatedly brings up the war issue and touts it as one of his principal issues. I think that's something that's very healthy, even if it's not necessarily healthy for his electoral prospects in the Republican primary. It's something that's healthy for the country as a whole. And ultimately, when push comes to shove, America, when it falls into depression and relieves itself of the tyrannical government that it currently has, it will live or die based on how much reality it has been able to accept. And Ron Paul's sentiments on the war issue will play a big part on whether or not, if this country is able to revitalize itself, if it can stay that way. As to the individual in question that I had the argument with, I haven't concluded the conversation with him yet, but I probably will. But I just wanted to leave all of you with this one little thought. There are a lot of things that you can do in life that will cause more harm than good, but you can argue based solely on the good that can come out of it, rather than even taking into account the other scenarios that can come about. When people think about approving a year's worth of activity in Libya, they don't really think on the fact that, the law was already broken, and if Obama wants the war in Libya to last, if he gets a second term, if he wants it to last for 5 more years, there's not a damn thing that Congress can do about it. Because they won't do anything about it ultimately. And the reason why they won't do anything about it is because you out there Mr. John Q. voter won't do anything to compel them to. The truth is the reason why I'm often so cynical and so aggravated is because ultimately part of me accepts the fact that all of the horrible things that this government is are things that we kind of collectively deserve because we've made it possible. The wars are largely the result of what America wants, even though they say they want otherwise. They're not willing to take the next step to force an actual change. Because at the end of the day, they're still pigs. As long as their slop trough is full, there's no real reason for them to do anything, regardless of the fact that one by one they'll be picked off, sent into the military, and then slaughtered for some good bacon, courtesy of your good friend and mine, Uncle Sam. People like to argue from the conspiratorial side that this consent that we've given has been manufactured through media manipulation. But bear something in mind, even if you take this view. This still wouldn't be possible if there wasn't some aspect of us that could be appealed to from that mode of thought. If we didn't think with our stomachs, if we weren't prone towards sloth and laziness, none of this manipulation would have worked, assuming that that is what caused this. Whether from a conspiratorial standpoint or simply from a general assessment of the way things are, the fact is we're in the situation we're in. I like to joke that I don't argue that there's some grand conspiracy to screw over this country. I like to say, if there was such a conspiracy, we would be just as bad off now as we are. So whether it's intentional or not, it's happening, and it sucks. I get tired of suffering through the sentiments of people who don't know what they're talking about. That's another thing that I've grown to dislike about people living in this country. Well, I don't know about that, but I'm going to tell you my opinion. It's beautiful. There's no room for facts. Everything is opinion. We need to get in touch with all of the different worldviews, and we need to form a more tolerant society. The only thing that's really universally hated is the truth. And the truth is that whether we are going into Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan specifically to liberate, or whether we're doing it just for our own questionable motivations, the people aren't any more or less dead that get caught in the crossfire. And there's always a crossfire, and there is always collateral damage, just as sure as there is light every time the sun comes up. The question isn't, are people going to die? The question is, how are you going to justify it? Pick your poison. Arsenic, rat poison, hemlock, hydrochloric acid, cyanide. Pick your poison. Me, myself, can't really do it anymore. I can't tolerate the poison drinkers, the Flavor Aid drinkers. I can't really be around them without my skin starting to crawl and without being taken over by a violent nausea on par with what's observed in the latter half of A Clockwork Orange. That's literally how I've been reacting to a lot of people who still live within the little two-party box, yet think that they're thinking outside of the box. So, ultimately, in this elongated rant, I'm just making one single point. I take the war issue a lot more seriously than others in my particular line of thinking do. Most people who are of my mindset are more concerned with internal policy, be it economic or other social issues. But me, foreign policy is a big one. It's a huge one, actually. There's consequences to it that we don't see, far more so than is the case with the economic seens and unseens that we see within our own economy. And that's the long and short of it. So until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.